Hi, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. This week's episode is one that I had been looking forward to for a long time. I am talking to Alice Twemlow. Alice's name comes up in other interviews all the time, and she was actually one of the first people on my list of people that I wanted to talk to when I started the podcast, so I am so glad that we were finally able to have this conversation. She, of course, is a design writer, a critic, an educator, historian, you name it. She was the co-founder and chair of SVA's design criticism program here in New York and is now the head of the design, curating, and writing program at the Design Academy Eindhoven. And especially relevant to our purposes, she recently published the book Sifting the Trash, which is this really fascinating history of design criticism. In this episode, we talk about that book and how design criticism has evolved over the years. We talk about the collapsing borders between the various design disciplines and the value in having what she calls a critical distance when writing about design. We also talk about how she got into all of this, from her family of designers to studying literature while she was in school. This was so fun for me. Alice's book was hugely influential to me when I was in grad school and working on my own thesis about design criticism. And if these topics are at all interesting to you, which I guess if you're listening to this, I imagine that they are, Alice's book is truly a must-read, and I think this conversation is a really nice primer into her work and her interests. So without further ado, here is my conversation with the great Alice Twemlow. When I started this project, you were one of the first people that I was really interested, one of the first people that I kind of added to the list of someone that felt very important for me to talk to. And as I've talked to all these other people, your name is one of those names that just kind of comes up again and again. And especially as I've gotten to know the people at SVA and in the Decrit program. But I don't actually know much about your background or how you got into any of this. And so I thought that would be a good place to start with just kind of where your interest in design came from. Yeah, sure.
Because I'm not a designer, as you probably figured out. So we'll start with that. I studied English literature at university in England, in Bristol University. But I come from a family of designers. My mother was an interior designer and my father was a graphic designer, but much more involved in education. He was a graphic design professor. Is a graphic design professor still. And so I'd always had design around, and it was sort of part of the atmosphere, I suppose, of my upbringing. But I was really keen to rebel against that, which sounds so ridiculous, by going the nerdy route of going to university and studying a completely useless discipline, which was English literature. And then that, in the course of that, I gradually became, I think what happened in my sort of revisionist history of the whole thing was I really got attracted to the visual aspects of literature, the emblem poetry, the frontispieces of books, the kind of typographic experimentation, the crazy stuff going on in Tristram Shandy and things like that. That's sort of, I noticed that's what kept coming to the fore for me. I did things like, edited the university magazine and got way more involved in the design of it than in the editing, as it turned out. So there were a few clues along the way that I maybe headed back toward design as a topic. And then I found there was this brilliant master's course called Design History. I'd never heard of that discipline at the time. And it was at the Royal College of Art and the Victoria and Albert Museum. And as soon as I identified that, I basically put on blinkers and just set my sights toward it. which involved things. Yeah, just kind of, I volunteered at the museum in Bristol, and sort of, I think I ended up cataloguing Yolika pottery tile. Very beautiful.
Yeah.
Things like that, all in the name of decorative arts. And anyway, I got onto this master's, this MA in the history of design. And I fell in love with it as a mode of engaging with design, being very, very close to design, because I was at the Royal College of Art, sort of,
right.
situated amid the making, and I was very involved, in everything going on in the graphic design department, especially. I catalogued all their posters for them, and I was just very close to the making, the lettered press workshop with Alan Kitching, all of that kind of thing, and was just so thrilled to discover there was these methods and tools and sort of modes of analysis that you could deploy to understand design, or to try and give it meaning and let it speak. And that was sort of it, really.
I mean, that's such an interesting answer, actually, and I feel like I have another 10 questions from that I was not planning to ask you, but I want to pick a couple things out of that quickly if we can. And one thing that's interesting is I didn't know that your kind of original background was in literature, and something that's been interesting in talking to so many people now is how many of the design writers that I like got into writing or stumbled into design through literature courses. And I'm thinking people like Alexander Lang or Michael Rock or Rob Giampetro all said essentially the same type of thing, which I think is just curious. I don't know if I really have a question there other than that it's interesting.
And it's an interest I've pursued, and I don't know exactly what the causal connection is either, but there's certainly this really cool resonance between work and design, and they exist very happily together. And I'm also drawn to those people who value that correspondence as well.
I don't know how to ask. I don't want this question to sound bad, and I'm always hesitant when I talk to people who are design writers who are not practicing designers. But I'm curious, was that just was never something that was interesting to you to actually be a designer? It sounds like the hook for you was finding the historical side of it.
Well, the academic discipline that I identified was the historic side of it.
Okay.
I ended up mutating that, or sort of customizing it, I suppose. I veered very quickly toward the contemporary and the very recent history of design. So my thesis on that course I mentioned was about the graphics and title sequences and set designs for a early pop program on the BBC. Sorry, not on the BBC, on Associated Rediffusion it was called, and it was called Ready, Steady, Go. And so that was in the 60s. So that's kind of historically I work from the 60s onwards, basically. So so that was I'm not in that. Well, anyway, history was pretty important to me, but it wasn't the hook. Whether or not to be a designer, do you know what? It hasn't really ever resurfaced for me. There's just way too much to do with that I'm doing. I really appreciate really, really good designers, and I like to sit alongside them. And I think that's sort of what's different and interesting, maybe, about me is. You may have discovered. I don't know if you've talked to Rick Poyner yet.
Not yet. He's obviously on my list, but
right. But there is a type of critic or a mode of criticism that he espouses, which is really very much about critical distance, which is very much like you. How can you? And this kind of relates back to your initial quandary of, can I operate a practice as a designer working for companies like Facebook,
right,
while also being a credible critic of,
right,
that kind of
right, yeah,
thing. I quite like this notion of critical proximity. That it's interesting to me to be embedded and to be close to it and to have to wrestle with those the problematics, I think, of design close up.
Right. Oh no, go ahead.
Just to finish off the thing of it's never been I should have been a designer. I never thought that, but I do feel like I want to be close to them, and I feel odd when I'm not.
Right.
And can I just give you one example? So I moved to Amsterdam recently, and we'll get to that, I'm sure, in the course of things. But one of the first jobs I had was at Vrij University, which is a very good university, and it's has a design studies department, masters, and so I was like, oh, fantastic, this is going to be great, and quickly signed up to teach there, and but it was so weird and sterile and bizarre to me to be operating in a kind of university context like that, so divorced from the practice of design.
Right.
I couldn't make sense of it. So that's how I operate. Basically, is like where I am now, working at Design Academy Eindhoven, or working at the KBK in The Hague, which is right in the middle of an art and design school, and that's basically where I'm happiest, as it turns out. So.
I mean, that actually kind of sets up two other questions that I had, and so I'm going to kind of give you both of them, and you can answer them how you want, because we might be skipping around your story a little bit. But I wanted to jump back to when you were studying literature. Did you think? What were you thinking you kind of wanted to do at that time? Were you thinking you were going to be a writer or an academic, kind of back then, or what was that kind of initial plan or kind of initial goals at that point?
Oh God, no! I wasn't clever enough or strategic enough to have any plans.
Okay, right.
I have such admiration for my current students who seem to have these kind of roadmaps.
Yeah.
I was doing literature because I loved it.
Okay.
That's as far as that really is. I mean, and sort of started to piece together a sense of a path, but no, I didn't. I definitely didn't want to be an academic. That wasn't part of my still thinking. That's PhD much later. And it sort of came out of the. So just to go back to when I graduated from that course, the history of design, and I said I was getting more interested in contemporary design. My first jobs out of that program was to work as a design journalist, in London, for a magazine called. Sounds so clunky, but Graphics International.
Oh, yes.
Which was a thing. And but I was super excited. I was sort of, I had a beat, and I was, writing articles and news articles and profiles of designers, and I was really happy doing that. And then, moved to New York, sort of got deeper and deeper into writing, and it was just through the enjoyment of the research and writing that led me to want to do a PhD and to further a kind of academic trajectory.
Okay.
So it sort of came late, my plan.
So before we get to that part, I just want to I know that there are kind of other pieces to this, but I want to fill in two things specifically, and especially something that you mentioned earlier, and I kind of want to talk about, I'm curious kind of where teaching came in, and I'm also, when you were talking about the kind of critical distance, that's something that's really been interesting to me as I talk to so many people from the Decrit program at SVA, is how many of those students are either kind of formerly practicing designers or still practicing designers, that there is that closeness that's been really fascinating to me. And so I guess that's kind of two parts of the question, is kind of where the teaching part fits, and then specifically SVA and Decrit and kind of those initial goals for that program when you started that.
Sure. Well, what you just described, the student body that I selected, that was design sensitive at the very least, and then or practicing as a designer, as the case was in some cases, was not easy. It was very problematic, I think, for some of them. I don't think it was, or is, it continues to be a struggle, but it's a struggle I think is really interesting.
Yeah.
And enriching. And so it's not like, I don't have a magic formula for fixing it.
Right.
So your initial conundrum, I think, underlies and will continue to underlie a lot of the interesting work. And I found out that was the same when I was researching the history of design criticism.
Yeah.
Those same struggles, about where to position yourself in relation to practice, in relation to the design as subject matter, how far you need to from it in order to reflect upon it, is a continuous kind of debate. Yeah, just to sort of go for the teaching idea, that I discovered that, again, looking back, I realized it felt very, very, very natural to me. And I realized that, in fact, all my family were teachers as well. And my grandmother was a cello teacher, and at the Royal Academy of Music in London, and even got an OBE for it. And my uncle and my aunt were, violin teachers. My grandfather was a violin teacher, and my dad is a teacher. So I just think there's a through line there that just puts me very naturally in that role. So I started teaching straight away out of my MA, and have sort of built on it over the years. Just got deeper and deeper, basically.
Right.
Now, Decrit was really when it all kicked off in a big way, because it was a wonderful moment when I decided to do the PhD. So I decided to kind of reorientate myself back towards academia, back towards London, back towards the history of design, discipline, all of that. And then at that very same moment, Steve Heller, who probably also figures in a lot of your conversations.
Yes. And he was one of my first interviews, actually.
Good, I'm glad. It should be. He gave me a phone call and asked me to, set up well, at that time, what he was thinking was a MA in design history and criticism. Or maybe it was just even history. I don't know. But anyway, my recommendation was I would love to do it, but I think I advocated skipping the history part, as I felt that was being done so well already by other programs.
Right.
But I felt it was design criticism that was missing. And this was at a moment, this was 2007, so this was just before everything crashed and burned and exploded. Before the foundations upon which that program might have been based were taken away from us. But anyway, in fact, it turned out to make it way more interesting. But I felt at that time that design criticism was gaining in volume and in breadth, but not in depth, So what my task, as I saw it with that program, was to refine it, really, to a large extent. I mean, expand it definitely in terms of imaginative outputs. That's always been something I've been very interested in, and the range of stuff we talk about and all that kind of stuff, but refine it in terms of its qualities and really taking the time to teach the skills and tools I saw as necessary to a kind of robust, rich, variant of criticism.
Yeah. So was that first kind of cohort of students, were you looking for designers? I kind of want to come back to this question about the kind of relationship and the proximity. And I'm kind of curious who you were looking for But then also, who were the types of people that were interested in the program, back 10 years ago now?
God, don't say that. Yeah,
Sorry.
I wasn't looking for designers. I was looking for a really good dinner party table, a really great array of ages and genders and interests and attitudes, commercial to, I just wanted a crazy mix. But what happened with that first cohort, I think, and what I loved about it was, for many of them, just like me with that design history program, when I found it, I got the sense, or at least this is what they told me, was that this was the thing they'd been waiting for all their life almost. Until someone named it and put it out there, they didn't necessarily know.
Yeah.
But suddenly there was a thing called design criticism, MA, and then it was an MFA. And so the first person to contact me is a really indicative person, I think, that sums up some of the stuff about the course, and that was Frederico Duarte from Portugal.
Oh, yeah.
So I remember he sent me a little email just going, yep, this is it. I think it was a tiny little announcement in Metropolis magazine, something like that, and he found it and said, I'm coming over.
Yeah.
And sure enough, he did. He got himself a Gulbenkian grant and arrived.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Pencil sharpened and literally just ate it all up with such gusto. And has gone on to do great things since then. That he's very typical, I think.
Yeah.
And he was trained as a designer and was teaching design. But I think the kind of qualities I was looking for was the curiosity and the passion and the criticality about design and its implications, and he had all of that in heaps. So yeah.
I mean, this is actually really interesting to me in that the program started in 2007, and so I was in my undergrad then, and I just recently, a couple weeks ago now, a month ago or so, I just recorded my 50th episode, and it was with Michael Beirut, who interviewed me. He kind of turned the tables and asked me about why I cared about design criticism. And, I kind of grew up in high school reading Design Observer and Speak Up. And he asked me if I was kind of conscious of that as criticism at the time. And I said no. I think I just liked that people were talking about this thing that I liked. And I was since then, I've been trying to figure out, when did that term design criticism kind of enter into my interests. And I think it might have been, I remember when the program launched and seeing that, and I'm now thinking that was kind of a revelation to me as a 18, 19-year-old at the time, thinking, oh, that's the kind of thing that I'm want to read and write someday. And I don't know if I made that connection until right now.
That's great.
I want to talk about the book a little bit, because I think all of your answers have been so hard for me to follow up, because you set up all these other questions that I have. And so I think the book is a great way to kind of set up the rest of the conversation, because I actually read the dissertation version of it, the PDF that was online, when I was in grad school, and it actually became a very good resource for me in my own research about design criticism. And so I'm kind of curious. I don't want this question to sound too reductive, but I'm very interested in your kind of process and framing of the book, and looking at the history of design criticism, how you began to start thinking about telling that story.
Well, thank you for reading it. And I think you can probably tell that I came to it from a literary perspective.
Yeah.
In the sense that I was, there were, when I was analysing the written forms of criticism, I do think I'm drawing there on my experience in English literature and using, analytical techniques that belong to literary analysis. So I think it sort of all ties together in that respect. But my initial premise, I think, was that design criticism, maybe this was my hypothesis, had always existed in multiple formats beyond the written word, and I wasn't quite sure how to research that, but that was my feeling, and I was interested in, well, I guess really testing that, can criticism be communicated and sort of folded into the narrative of an exhibition or into the fabric of a designed object or a conference in the case of the aspect. So that was definitely part of it. And I did exactly what you're not supposed to do with a PhD, which is you're supposed to pick a really, really, really small thing or phenomenon, tiny little time frame, tiny little, regional location, and then extrapolate the wider implications from that. I did it absolutely wrong, and I would never advise any of my students ever again. I took on this huge sprawling task of, kind of surveying an entire, half century.
Right.
I wouldn't say my process was particularly scientific, as it turned out. But what I devised as one way in was to try and locate points in that history, I'm putting that in quote marks here, that I thought were ruptures or disruptions to the way things were normally done, upsettings of the status quo, and using that as a way to kind of identify moments of contestation, because that's what I thought, the discourse around criticism then would be more apparent and more self-reflective at those moments. So that's really one aspect of my methodology. I suppose. But yeah, I don't like talking about it, I suppose. But I mean, it was a lot of it was just kind of. One more thing I should mention about my process that you relate to is I just love interviewing people, and I love really, kind of surfacing insights about this practice of criticism through conversation and repeated conversations, and that was that's a method, and one of my favorite aspects of doing that research.
Yeah, I mean that totally comes across in the book too, is how many of the voices that you quote came out of personal conversations, which I those were some of my favorite parts, were when you were kind of sitting talking to these people. Did writing that and researching that change how you thought about design criticism today?
Yeah, it was tricky, I must say, because and I thought about this recently, because it wasn't so much what I thought about design criticism today, but I was teaching it at the time.
Oh, right.
So I was in a very sort of, conflict of interest kind of situation where I wonder to what extent I was searching for the kind of history that would support my style of teaching and the way I was interpreting criticism today. And vice versa. I wonder if I was taking those principles, from a very contemporary situation of media implosion, and using that as a sort of tracking that back in a historically suspect way.
Yeah.
I don't know if I actually did that, but I wonder if that was, there as a sort of dilemma for me as I was going through, and how it made me think about design criticism thing. Well, yes. Well, okay. I think basically what I ended up deducing is just that there is this generally accepted opinion or sort of notion that there was a golden heyday of criticism,
right?
That it once existed in a perfect state, and it's just been in decline ever since.
Yeah.
So there's this notion there being this fantastic sort of centralized conversation and appointed public intellectuals who were able to lead that conversation in meaningful ways. And, to a certain extent, that narrative does bear out. But within design criticism specifically, I'm not sure. I feel it's always been a very fugitive enterprise, I think, is a phrase that I use. Yeah. And it's always been quite dispersed. And, certainly there was certainly more of a central conversation than there is today. And it is in a bit of the mess that we have now, I sometimes find very energizing, because I sometimes think, yes, this is exactly the kind of chaos in which new things are formed, and we need this, in order to break it all down so we can build it all up again. And so sometimes I get very energized by the sort of dispersed nature of the critical conversation today. But at other points, I just get exhausted.
Yeah.
I don't know how you.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I think about a lot, and I often, when I listen back, I recently listened back to some of my early episodes for something else that I was doing, and realized how many times I would kind of make comments about wanting more design criticism or more design writing, and then realizing that there's actually kind of more people talking about this stuff than ever before. Exactly. And how you, something that I've been thinking about a lot is, how do you kind of parse out what is the stuff that's even worth talking about? Because not every piece of design needs to have, a kind of focused critical response.
No, exactly. But today I think it's so much, as in all aspects of life, it's about the filters, and it's about the lens that you shape in order to, to kind of extract the particular ingredients that you want for your intellectual kind of stuff.
Right. I mean, and I wonder. This is a question that I'm asking you because you've kind of studied the history, but something that I think about a lot, or sometimes feel like, I have no proof of this, is that graphic design criticism in relation to the other design criticisms or other design disciplines, the criticism around them, is that graphic design often is just can sometimes be superficial, and can sometimes just be talking about the way a logo or a poster looks, where things like architecture or industrial design often will deal with economics and kind of place. And so my first question is kind of, is that a false assumption on my part? And then I'm kind of also curious how you think about the relationship between the different types of design and the criticism around them.
Sure. I think that is a false assumption. I do think that there is a very, because I sort of started out by knowing more about graphic design criticism, and then I've gone more and more toward product design criticism and other forms, and I think there's a particularly rich seam of discourse around graphic design. I think I know the kind you're referring to, though, when it's sort of there is a danger, because graphic design is the most ephemeral of the design disciplines, that its kind of commentary and critique ends up the same way, and has to operate at that same speed. But if some of the people you've been interviewing and mentioning are coming from graphic design discourse specifically,
right?
I'm still very interested. I certainly haven't given up on that at all. In terms of, can I tell you a little bit about the stuff I'm into right now?
Yeah, of course. That was one of my later questions. So yeah, let's talk about it now.
I'm really mucking up the questions, but it's just to just elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah.
Because I think I don't really see it in terms of these discipline silos so much anymore.
Right.
And I don't know that we have to, because the magazines don't exist anymore. Mm-hmm. And because, there is just, we have to acknowledge this sort of interdisciplinary momentum.
Right.
I just see it much more of a blur.
Yeah, I agree. I'm the same way.
Design and its implications, and those are very enmeshed, whether it's, the graphic design or the urban planning, or the shape of the objects within it. They all very much relate to me, and I'm not sure that you can distinguish them particularly.
Right. Yeah.
So the stuff I'm into at the moment, and it's led out of the book. So I wrote this history of design criticism, and I found there were these two metaphors, right, for kind of dealing with this huge wobbly body of work. And then one was this idea of the critic as a sort of diagnoser of sickness, the sickness of society.
Right.
And design's complicity therein, and the critic was in some respects a homeopath or a doctor or a medicine man. There are these kind of these terms echo through the work I was looking at. But the other thing that sort of really gained traction for me is this idea of the critic as a sifter of the trash, as a gatekeeper between the production of design and its ultimate demise in the landfill, the deciding what's treasure, what's trash, what's in, what's out, what the shifting and negotiating of value.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that just was a metaphor for me, and one that I identified in so much of the writing and writing plus type of criticism I was engaging with. But then I've actually really started to get interested in trash itself, in the physical manifestations of and the meanings of trash. Mm-hmm. How trash is conceived in the popular imagination, and how it relates to climate change, to the Anthropocene I'm super into right now.
Right.
All that stuff is, and once you get to that level, and once you start looking at things in terms of geological time and all these super interesting things like Timothy Morton's hyperobjects and all of that, disciplines and stuff like that seem completely meaningless. It really this stuff that used to be, individual logo and the stuff like it. It's just not. It's much more part of a sort of really complex social, political, environmental phenomenon that we have to tackle using all the tools and skills we can get from the humanities, social sciences, and everywhere. So that's where I am at the moment, sort of on a maybe a bit meta or something, but not so bothered. Is it graphic design or not?
Yeah, no, I am 100% on board with that. I feel like that's definitely the direction where I'm headed and how I've started to think about a lot of this stuff also. And that actually really nicely leads into my few kind of final questions to lead into the end. Because a question that I ask everybody that I talk to, and you kind of started answering it already, is what are the issues or topics that designers or design writers or critics should be talking about and writing about today?
This sounds like when I have to do my sort of thesis brainstorming sessions with my students, I talk about urgencies and but we always do start with what is something very personal, try and find that sort of personal connection to the topics that surround us. And then we go out from there. And yeah, I mean, for me, it really does all. Right now, I'm in not a bubble, but a kind of really a concentration of focus on environmental issues, and that's really what I'm super interested in right now. So, for example, in recent weeks, I've been examining the notion of repair in relation to design. To what extent can we build repair into our design? And it often gets talked about just in terms of products and objects, but I mean, I'm talking about digital and all aspects of how, our houses, our infrastructures, our urban plans, just sort of really tackling this notion of getting rid of this notion of the closed design product, right? This finished, completed solution. I'm very anti-solution.
I love that.
So repair was one of the things that I think is a very interesting knife to kind of cut into the subject matter. I've been going. What have I went to last week? I went to a really interesting seminar on nuclear waste because I do think that's a massive issue in terms of storage, signaling, and again, another way in which all these disciplines kind of meld into one combined effort. It's a perfect example of a wicked problem, isn't it? So things like that. That's through an environmental humanities research centre, which I'm finding a very interesting and useful way into design. Or at least it's a place where I can bring a fresh perspective onto design. It's a good new set of tools, basically, environmental humanities. So things like that, things like just the excess of stuff. There is just so many topics. I can't even. Some of the things my students are looking at are really cool at the moment. Like, one student just did a great project about the porta potty as a sort of totemic symbol of the problems of sanitation in South African informal settlements. Oh, wow. So she took the object very literally, and looked at its history as a sort of camping, leisure item from the US, and its reappropriation in these in the new context of a South African informal settlement, and then and all of its inadequacies, and then how it's become symbolic of a sort of protest movement. Wow. So things like that, anything like that, like a sort of a aspect of design that gives you a 360, that gives you the ability to reflect upon society in a hopefully meaningful and illuminating way are the topics I think we should be looking at. And maybe that could be a new logo. Maybe it could. Right. It really does depend on how you do it. So I guess it's not the subject matter, but so much as the approach and the questioning. But that's just some of the things I meant.
I love that. That was a great answer. My final question for you, it's kind of a two-part question, but I'm interested in, I'm curious kind of who are the writers or the critics who have really influenced you and your work, and then also the people that you're reading now who are kind of influencing these things that you're thinking about now, or people that, if you were to give a reading list to me or to the listeners, who's on that list?
Sure. Well, the people who have influenced me, I would say it's actually a really wide range of writers, and they often tend to be from the literary sphere, I suppose. I mean, one that I always end up coming back to is Nicholson Baker.
Oh, yeah. I love
novelist. We had him speak at one of our conferences, and it was literally one of my best moments at Decrit when I got to sort of introduce him and
I watched that. I remember that. I watched the Vimeo video of that. Yeah.
Yeah, and he had that brilliant sort of meditation on the wrapping of glass.
I forgot all about that.
Yeah, and he had this idea of wrapping objects in words, and it was just, I could have listened to him all day.
Yeah.
So that kind of there's one essay in particular I sort of always hold up as a, I think, pretty genius example of design criticism. Is it's about the nail clippers, and he because we haven't really got to this, but one of the things I think really underpins good criticism is research, and I often think that's overlooked or not understood how that works, or but when you see evidence of that in a piece where he visits the factory where the nail clippers are made,
right.
This incredibly beautiful exposition on their making, and so it's just you have to go read it. It's great. It's called Nail Art.
Okay.
So there's that kind of writing, and then I suppose most of us return back to Rainer Banham, and I really do enjoy and have fed from his curiosity and his spirit. That sense of openness that you can meditate on the nature of a crisp packet, to great effect. And I think we take that very for granted now, that we have that in design way more than other disciplines. But we have that appreciation, and the everyday has been normalized for us, as a topic. And but in fact, that was pretty revolutionary. And then in the book, the one that I really, really enjoyed getting to know and understand was this woman, Deborah Allen, one of the editors of Industrial Design magazine in the 50s, and she was a car critic, car reviewer. Mm-hmm. And I think I just liked the whole package there, the fact that she was a mum of 5 kids, and she was just this sort of quite sassy New Yorker, and just her whole thing.
Yeah. I love that.
But I'm not going to go listing loads, because they're quite sort of scattered. And but I will get to the reading list thing in a minute, but can I just make another point that just occurred to me?
Yeah, of course.
I was just thinking about it. When you were saying in the beginning your sort of initial quandary, this idea of just as the spectrum, right, between sort of evil commerce and, and sort of I don't know, benign criticism, which is not the case at all. So how do you figure it out? And I do think that's such an interesting question, and all the different strategies people have deployed, right? Yeah. And so many of us have ended up in an academic setting, in a university, and I it's not devoid of problems at all, and it's arguably you can track the, as in the wire, follow the money kind of thing. Yeah. You can track it back just as much within a university setting as you can within a commercial setting. But it does allow for certain things. And one of the things that I feel helps us with this is the practice of research.
Yeah.
And it can be framed many ways, but as a designer, if you do practice-oriented research, that is research that's conducted through the tools, methods, media, materials, and sensibilities of design specifically, that's a pretty interesting realm. And I do think it allows something different from the binary that you're setting up between criticism and commerce or practice,
Yeah.
I found it to be very helpful. Yeah,
and I think that's a great way to put it. And I feel like as I've talked to more people and have kind of come out of the other side of graduate school now, that's increasingly the way that I am seeing this, and that criticism and practice are not actually not necessarily opposing points of view at all, and can actually really do come together. And I think practice-based research is kind of the great intersection of those in a lot of ways. So I think you're exactly right.
Yeah. So that's what I'm. My new role is in Holland the design lectors. It basically means well, they translate it as professor, but it's not really professor. I think it's closer to being a reader. But I get to set up my own research group basically at this really great art school called the Royal Academy of Art in The Hague.
Oh, wow.
And I'm doing it around this notion of design in the deep future.
I love that already.
I think, yeah, anyway. And what I'm hoping that allows for is just a reconsideration of time in relation to design. So that we maybe can get out of this sort of the speed problem,
right.
Of the, a factory conveyor belt straight onto press release, straight into landfill situation.
Right.
So just sort of reconceiving of things through these layers of geological time and cosmic time and all of these cool stuff. That's sort of what I'm grappling with at the moment. So that's kind of where my reading is based on lots of stuff about geologists and people and the stratification society. What are they called again? It's a body of scientists that basically get to decide which geological era we're in. Stratigraphic, that's it. Stratigraphic research. So they're the ones who've made the recommendation that we are actually officially in the Anthropocene and probably have been since the 1950s. So that I'm reading those reports at the moment. Brian Thill is an English literature professor.
Okay.
Who wrote a fantastic little book called Waste, which I keep coming back to.
Oh, okay.
Which is a really good summary of a lot of these concerns. Timothy Morton, who I mentioned before, hyper objects. I don't know. I should go to my desk and see what's piled up in anticipation of reading. Yeah. I think I just been flicking through the Mark Week and Beatrice Palomina, Are We Human?
I love that book so much.
Yeah, because they have a sort of great section on kind of archaeology and this stuff opens up ideas for me. I really like that.
The Mark Wigley and Beatrix Palomina book, listeners are probably tired of. I feel like I bring that book up in every episode. So first of all, I'm glad that you brought it up this time. But that has set me off on all sorts of different kind of research tracks that I was not doing before I read the book, I don't know, maybe 6 months ago or so, and just has completely changed a lot of the things that I'm thinking about. I love what they're doing right now.
Yeah, and I think they have a good ability, and I take issue with some of it. They're a little cavalier.
Yeah.
About some of our precious design things, right?
Of course.
But it is useful to get that sort of it's like the powers of 10.
Yeah.
That smart view of design, and they really do help us see it from a less precious perspective, I suppose.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, and they see it. They help us see it as entangled as it actually is, and I enjoy that.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's a great way to kind of wrap this up. Thank you so much for talking with me. This was so fun. I'm looking over my notes, and we've covered basically everything that I was kind of wanting to ask you about, and I'm glad we finally got to do this, and it was really fun for me. So thank you so much.
You're great. You have such a good radio voice as well.
Oh, thanks.
No wonder you ended up doing this. It's perfect.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much.
All right. Well, it's a real pleasure, Brett.
This episode was recorded on October 19th, 2017. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us on Apple Podcasts and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.